Among more curious excerpts of the clever crow.
The air in the outer woods of the town of Halam was thick with the damp scent of earth and pine, a far cry from the refined city streets of Silfair. Gregor Huber, the self-proclaimed local hero, ambled ahead of me, leaving a trail of questionable tracking methods in his wake. I had my suspicions about this so-called beast we were after. A Thrundle, Gregor insisted on calling it. Silly name, silly description, obviously fabricated, though there were witnesses attesting to some manner of beast, so I remain open-minded. Though I'm given pause at Gregor's display of talent. Gregor's tracking skills, if you could call them that, were a spectacle to behold. He'd bend down to pick up a leaf, study it as if it held the secrets of the universe, then promptly pop it into his mouth. A few meters further, he'd run his hands over the bark of a tree, casting furtive glances in my direction, as if seeking approval for his bizarre ritual. Perhaps it was some primitive form of communion with nature, or maybe he just liked the taste of leaves. All the same, it was bad performance art, and I was reluctantly playing the role of the clueless audience. Every now and then, he'd stop, stare off into the distance, and then dramatically point in a completely different direction. I couldn't decide whether he was intentionally leading me astray, or if he genuinely believed in his woodland theatrics. My guess leaned toward the former, given the stakes of our quest. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the rhythmic crunch of fallen leaves beneath our boots merged with the distant rustling of harmless squirrels avoiding our gaze. Gregor's erratic maneuvers continued, and I couldn't help but shake my head in disbelief. My training with the Imperial Services Guild had honed my tracking skills to a razor's edge, a far cry from this display of mysticism and tree-hugging.
Beware the Thrundle. Gregor, in his absurd performance as a tracker extraordinaire, stopped abruptly, his keen eyes fixating on a seemingly inconspicuous patch of foliage that Rovil recognized instantly. Kneeling down, Gregor's hands hovered over the foliage like a mystic preparing for a ritual. Rovil, observing the spectacle with a mix of exasperation and curiosity, contemplated whether to let the man indulge in his bizarre antics. However, a faint glimmer of responsibility prompted Rovil to speak up.
Do be careful of the poison ivy.
Gregor's head shot up, a sheepish grin on his face.
Oh, yes, right.
He stammered, hastily standing up. His flushed expression met Rovil's discerning gaze.
Just checking something. Yes.
The detective arched an eyebrow, but chose not to press the matter further. Instead, they continued their journey deeper into the woods, Gregor leading the way with a renewed sense of purpose. Rovil, however, couldn't shake the feeling that the local hero was not what he seemed or attempted to seem. That is, as they traversed the uneven terrain, Rovil's impatience grew, and he couldn't resist addressing Gregor once more.
Gregor,
he inquired, his voice maintaining the delicate balance between curiosity and feigned ignorance.
I can't help but wonder, what exactly are you looking for out here? I mean, aside from leaves and the occasional tree to commune with.
Gregor shot him a sidelong glance, momentarily ceasing his eccentric routine.
Detective, my friend, this is the dance of the wild. The Thrundle leaves its mark in the subtlest of ways, and only the keenest eyes and senses can decipher its trail.
Rovil fought the urge to roll his eyes, maintaining the guise of a city detective out of his element.
The Thrundle, you say? Any chance it has a penchant for theatrics and a love for leaves?
A chuckle escaped Gregor's lips, resonating through the woods like a secret, shared only among the trees.
Heh. You're learning, detective, learning. The Thrundle's ways are mysterious, but with my guidance, we shall unveil its wretched path to its horrible lair.
Yet Rovil couldn't dismiss the nagging suspicion that Gregor's theatrics were more than just an odd method of tracking. The deaths in Halam seemed too conveniently linked to this fantastical creature, and Gregor's sudden appearance. His antics did little to console Rovil's skepticism. The forest continued to envelop Rovil and Gregor in its dense embrace as they pressed on, the foliage closing in around them. Gregor, undeterred by Rovil's skeptical glances, bent down again, this time seizing a grasshopper with an almost childlike enthusiasm. He inspected it with exaggerated concentration, hoping to showcase some profound insight into the Thrundle's activities. Noticing Rovil's critical expression, Gregor hesitated for a moment, the grasshopper still clasped between his fingers. Then, with a flourish that seemed more for dramatic effect than anything else, he popped the insect into his mouth. Rovil winced as Gregor chewed, the man's eyes squinting against the unexpected, unpleasant bitterness. Once again, pointing in a vague direction, Gregor declared,
"Yes, this way!"
Idiot.
Rovil thought, stifling a sigh as they resumed their trek through the woods. Their journey led them to a clearing, and in its heart stood an old abandoned shack, its walls crumbled and timbers warped with age. A well, weathered and worn, stood as a sentinel to forgotten times. Rovil couldn't help but think about the disappearance of the sheriff of Halam, a scenario eerily similar to his current pursuit. The story of the sheriff being caught off guard, dragged into the wilderness by some monstrous creature, lingered in his mind. As they walked further into the clearing, Gregor, seemingly oblivious to Rovil's cynical contemplations, pulled out a short, thin hunting sword with a flourish.
"Yes, this is the spot,"
he declared, turning to Rovil, who quizzically arched a brow.
"The beast won't show itself if it sees me.
Gregor explained with an unnerving, smug grin.
I've got it proper scared of me now, so I'll need you to take the lead."
Rovil began drawing his sword, only to be interrupted by Gregor's warning tone.
"Oh, no, no, no! If it sees your sword, it won't come out!"
Gregor's self-satisfied expression did little to reassure Rovil.
I see.
He replied, shooting Gregor a suspecting glance before moving ahead, taking the lead with a cautious step. Rovil, unsure of his next move, wandered closer to the well. He could feel the weight of Gregor's eyes firmly fixed on his back, the intensity of Gregor's breathing escalating in the charged silence of the clearing. Sensing the tension, Rovil turned to glance at Gregor from the corners of his eyes. Gregor, caught in the act, hastily shifted his expression from sweaty concentration to a foolish, nervous grin upon realizing that Rovil had been watching him. The detective redirected his gaze toward the well, playing his cards close to his chest.
A good place for a murder, yes?
Rovil mused, his voice carrying a subtle edge.
Isolated, abandoned and likely relatively unknown to locals. Far enough from town that we can't be heard, and even a convenient hiding spot for the body.
Rovil pivoted toward Gregor, facing him directly. Gregor posed conspicuously with his tarnished hunting sword raised above his head, poised to strike.
Aha! So you've finally seen through my ruse, but all too late!
Gregor menaced, readying himself to pounce. Rovil, unimpressed by the theatrics, sighed and pulled out his flintlock pistol. With a deliberate motion, he pulled back the hammer and aimed it dead center at Gregor's chest. The sudden, lethal shift in the standoff caused Gregor to stop dead in his tracks, dropping his sword in surprise.
Ooh, you have a gun?
Gregor's tone changed abruptly, shifting from menace to sudden, genuine surprise. The realization of the dire situation seemed to dawn on him in an instant as he eyed the barrel of Rovil's pistol. The once confident local hero now stood disarmed and vulnerable, caught in the tangled web of his own deceit.
A jest. Of course, to ease the tension.
Gregor chuckled nervously, his hands raised above his head in a half-hearted attempt at surrender. Rovil, unamused and with his pistol still aimed at Gregor's chest, arched an eyebrow.
Feigning attempted murder of an agent of the Imperial Services Guild, more so myself, is supposed to ease my tension?
He inquired, a touch of incredulity in his voice.
Yes, well, not everyone is privy to the nuances of dark humor, I suppose.
Gregor replied with a smug tone, attempting to brush off the severity of the situation. Rovil kept a steady gaze on Gregor, his patience wearing thin.
I apologize. I know so little about you, a trend among those I've questioned in Halam. What exactly was your profession before becoming the local town hero, monster hunter?
Gregor paused, biting his lip nervously, his eyes darting about as if searching for a suitable answer. Anything but the truth.
I am a hunter, clearly of strange creatures not of this world, you see. Delving into the dark, unseen fathoms of the world, hunting those that lay in wait in the shadows of society's unexplored corners of...
Rovil, unconvinced by Gregor's over-theatrical speech, interrupted with a pointed gesture, reasserting his pistol by aiming it at Gregor's face.
Oh no! We've awoken the Thrundle!
Gregor's voice warbled with a theatrical tremble that wouldn't have convinced an audience at a child's birthday party. Gregor's eyes tightly closed as if straining, and Rovil couldn't help but notice the odd movement of Gregor's hand, as if manipulating an unseen hand puppet. Rovil's attention was momentarily diverted from Gregor's odd hand movements as he picked up strangely corresponding sounds emanating from the well. Turning his head, he kept his pistol aimed at Gregor, but his curiosity grew as he noticed a bizarre, hairy creature emerging from the depths of the well. The creature was a nightmarish amalgamation, a patchwork of fur and limbs that seemed poorly stitched together. Its face, frozen in a vicious, unmoving snarl, seemed like a grotesque fusion of several animals. The furry skin hung abnormally loose, and as it stretched its limbs wide, menacingly displaying sharp-looking claws, it bellowed,
"Roar! I am the Thrundle! I am awoken!"
Rovil, momentarily taken aback, shot a glance back at Gregor, who had one eye open, peering at Rovil with an almost mischievous expression. The Thrundle looked like an enormous, ugly, absurd hand puppet, and Rovil couldn't help but notice the strange coordination between Gregor's actions and the creature's voice and movement.
"Hard, hard, hard! If you know what's best for you, you should let that man go. He is the only one that can stop me."
Gregor's lips moved in sync with the Thrundle's voice. Rovil, further annoyed, narrowed his eyes, responding with a grim smile.
Is that so, Mr. Thrundle? I should think you would prefer me to do away with him then.
He stepped closer to Gregor, pressing the pistol against his forehead.
"Oh gods, no! Please don't! Yes, but alas, I am a monster undeserving of life in this world, too cowardly to stop my reign of terror or end it myself. I need him if I am to die. Redeemed!"
The Thrundle's, rather Gregor's voice, strained and desperate, continued the pathetic performance.
I suppose I can assist with that.
Rovil retorted. He turned the gun toward the Thrundle and fired. The bullet passed through its hollow, saggy flesh easily. In that exact moment, Gregor screamed in agonized pain, a small hole appearing in the center of his hand. Gregor collapsed and tears streamed down his face. The Thrundle hung limply over the side of the well, a giant puppet manipulated by some truly innovative use of magic. The unsettling charade had come to an end, leaving Rovil to contemplate the bizarre intersection of deception, puppetry, and the mysterious creature they had pursued. Rovil deftly tucked the single-fire pistol back into its holster. Drawing his sword, he approached the whimpering Gregor, who lay on the ground, a picture of defeat.
Do you concede?
Rovil inquired, his voice laced with a mix of sternness and curiosity.
All I wanted was to be a famous travelling entertainer.
Gregor blurted out between whimpers.
I spent so much time writing my plays and even studied for a bit at Silfair's Bard Academy. They told me to give up, that my long-honed skills were better suited for coal mining at best. Inept, they called me. But I knew better, so I turned to puppet theatre. They don't argue or call the dialogue contrived and unrealistic. No one just randomly spouts exposition like that, they said. How is anyone supposed to follow what's going on?
Write your own truth, I suppose.
Rovil chuckled, realizing the irony in the situation.
So, I taught myself the craft, but I needed an edge to make it that much more special.
Gregor continued, his voice a mix of frustration and desperation.
Magic?
Rovil inquired, though he already knew the answer.
Yes, I suppose that should be clear.
Gregor replied, his eyes avoiding direct contact. Rovil's eyes narrowed impatiently.
Allow me to speculate the rest of the story. You put on a show? Introduced your new gimmick of sorts? Telekinesis, yes?
Would that have worked better?
Gregor asked, looking up at Rovil with a hint of vulnerability, the remnants of his theatrical bravado fading away. Rovil momentarily regarded Gregor with a mix of pity and concern.
What, pray tell, form of magic were you using?
Soul bonding, linked to my hand, specifically.
Gregor answered meekly, his eyes downcast.
You bound your soul to an enormous hand puppet.
Rovil couldn't help but exclaim.
The gods must have had a laugh about that one. I'm sorry, very unprofessional of me.
He composed himself, realizing the gravity of the situation.
You put on your show, introduced your gimmick. Did they laugh and heckle you?
They didn't even notice me. Droves of them walked by, not even seeing my show. Who passes on free entertainment?
Gregor's frustration was palpable.
I had to do something to get someone's attention.
Rovil's expression darkened as he thought about the first victim, the farmhand, Anatol Edita.
I'd wager that something led to an unintentional death.
He questioned, a grimace crossing his face.
The plan was, I'd have the Thrundle pop out in front of him and scare him a bit, though in a fun, whimsical way, and then direct him toward the puppet show.
Gregor explained.
He simply and calmly sidestepped it and tried to move around. In the moment, perhaps desperation, I'd resolved to not let him pass me by, so I opted to have the Thrundle grab him, but it went wrong. So very wrong. People were scared then. I couldn't let people know what I'd done. So, as they say in the acting world, commit, commit, commit!
Rovil's eyes narrowed at the admission.
So, you entered your own imaginary world of puppets and played the role of the mysterious heroic protagonist, knowing that from behind your booth no one had ever seen you before.
Gregor nodded, acknowledging the truth.
And then there was that sheriff fellow. You've got me on that one. Well, he was just trying to take the wind out of my sails, nosy fellow. You would get along with him nicely, though. Couldn't stand to just let me have my hard-earned fame, investigating and prodding around.
The weight of Gregor's delusions and crimes hung heavy in the air as Rovil grappled with the bizarre narrative that had unfolded before him. End of part 1.
Here I'm playing a character in a warped tale spun by a delusional puppeteer, a man who, at his core, appears more hapless fool than malevolent mastermind. Gregor, with his colossal soul-bound hand puppet and a penchant for theatrics, seems to be floundering in a pool far deeper than he anticipated. The notion of pressing him further begins to feel akin to bullying, an exercise in exploiting the vulnerabilities of a man ensnared in his own manufactured narrative. The first death, the farmhand, Anatol Edita, bears the stain of accident, an unintentional consequence of a poorly executed plan. Manslaughter at worst, a desperate act to grasp at a semblance of recognition that slipped through this puppeteer's fingers. The sheriff's demise, on the other hand, reeks of murder, plain and simple. Whether it was premeditated or not, remains to be seen. Gregor's actions appear to be a chaotic dance, an impromptu performance panicked through each scenario, lacking the finesse of a true orchestrator of death. Yet, beneath the veneer of ineptitude, there lies a chilling truth. Despite the theatrics, Gregor exhibited an unsettling determination, a willful intent to murder in cold blood. His attempt on my life, though pathetic and transparent, betrayed a premeditated darkness, a sinister plot woven into the threadbare fabric of his misguided ambitions. Carefully I ponder the remaining lingering question: what else lies beneath the surface of this desperate puppeteer's fragile stage? The unregistered use of vow magic adds another layer of concern. Foolish as it may be, it highlights the difficulty of enforcing the Empire's attempts to regulate mages. The veneer of control over magic is fragile, and individuals like Gregor slip through the cracks, casting their spells in the shadows until they snap, their presence thrust into the forefront. Mage madness, they call it, a slowly unraveling inevitability of unnatural understanding, not entirely meant for mortal minds. Gregor's antics, while comically inept, unveil a darker truth about the volatile undercurrents of magic in our world. The thin line between regulation and chaos becomes more apparent, a constant challenge in maintaining order in a realm where the fantastical and the mundane intersect.
Frustration etched across Rovil's features. He reached into his coat and produced a set of handcuffs. These weren't the conventional, bulky iron restraints. They were a new compact form of mechanical shackles, a marvel of new alloys and dwarven technology commissioned and provided by the Imperial Services Guild. The mechanical ratcheting lock mechanism clicked ominously as Rovil prepared to secure Gregor.
It sounds to me like the sheriff was doing his job. Quite well, I might add. Had you simply surrendered this farce, you might have dodged a murder conviction.
Rovil remarked, the sharp edge of disappointment in his voice. A flicker of panic crossed Gregor's face, his eyes darting wildly as the reality of his situation sank in. Rovil, ever observant, noticed the dangerous shift in Gregor's behavior. He swiftly held his sword out, pointing it directly at Gregor's heart.
Don't do anything. Everything you've tried has just made your life more difficult. Don't do anything!
Rovil asserted, his tone stern and commanding, a warning against any rash actions that could escalate the situation further.
Far too early to call the curtain, Detective.
Gregor retorted in a tone attempting confidence.
The villain has yet to be dispatched, and the day saved for the protagonist. The climax has yet to be reached.
Unnerved, Rovil quietly watched Gregor's face for the familiar tells he had seen earlier when Gregor was manipulating the Thrundle puppet. However, instead of the expected signs of manipulation, he was met with glaring eye contact and a delusional, confident grin. Gregor's eyes slowly shifted to the entrance of the dilapidated old house. Rovil turned briefly to check, finding nothing, and turned back to Gregor, who had gotten some distance and was in the process of scurrying to his feet, intent on escape. Rovil, fueled by frustration and a sense of justice, walked with purpose up to the foolish puppeteer, his patience worn thin. He grabbed Gregor by the collar of his not-so-elaborate monster-hunting costume. The garishly decorated armor pieces, little more than tin, clinked against each other, and the shiny cloth did little to hide the absurdity of the ensemble.
That was almost clever,
Rovil stated in a stern tone, his grip firm.
To speak in theatrical terms, as you are so predisposed, the show, as you call it, is over. Whether you call the curtain or not. This is little more than an unwelcome encore. Take your bow and leave the stage.
The weight of Rovil's words hung in the air, a final decree to the farcical drama Gregor had woven around himself.
A false ending. Yes, I've heard of such high concepts in playwriting before. A seemingly dour ending for the hero, a touch of realism to the fantasy. But the villain, having won the battle, has overlooked something that may cost him the war of wills.
Gregor chattered excitedly, his eyes gleaming with manic enthusiasm. Rovil glared at the hacky performer, his impatience finally coming to a head.
Believe me, I've read your script like literature several times over. Plagiarism at best. You are the very image of narcissism with reference to delusion.
And yet you keep coming back. Methinks you may be a resentful fan.
Gregor scoffed, his bravado undeterred.
You're missing the point.
Rovil growled, irritation seeping into his voice.
I think it is you who is missing my point, Detective.
Gregor laughed, his tone bordering on madness.
What kind of puppeteer would I be if I weren't ambidextrous?
Rovil's eyes widened, realization dawning too late. In the heat of the moment, he had overlooked a strange sensation, as if something were lightly crawling about on his person. His eyes shifted to a point of pressure on his left shoulder. There, a small, normal-sized for a puppet, figure resembling a wooden-headed knight with a sword, was perched. It slashed for Rovil's eyes with the miniature but sharp and pointed sword. Rovil turned his face away, the tiny blade only managing to wound his left cheek. The unexpected attack caught him off guard, and he recoiled, a mixture of surprise and anger clouding his features.
You reek of an orcish brothel.
The voice emanates from the night hand puppet, a crass imitation of a Florinian accent, with phrasing offending multiple cultures all at once, no doubt a crude attempt at humor.
The blazes?
Rovil exclaims, his patience worn thin. He grabs at the offending hand puppet on his shoulder, but his hand is quickly jabbed by the tiny sword.
Stupid giant, you cannot defeat the glorious Gradasso.
Gregor's terrible attempt at an accent continues to grate on Rovil's nerves. Rovil, increasingly agitated, continues to flail about wildly, desperately trying to remove the strange, magically manipulated hand puppet that has become an unexpected and irritating adversary in this surreal encounter. The puppeteer's bizarre antics escalate, turning a dangerous confrontation into a farcical struggle with an enchanted miniature knight.
You must pay for your insolence. Grovel, turkey feather, sticking your big, stupid, ugly nose in the business of a true genius.
The offensive attempt at humor continued in tandem with the attempt at murder.
I chop at a nose.
Please pardon the brief pause, I feel it necessary to elaborate. It's well known amongst those trained in fighting that broadcasting your next move is a fatal mistake. It can be as simple as a quick targeted glance, a raise of the shoulder, the position of a foot. Given Gregor's known history, it's unlikely that he knew much at all about the nuances of combat. Shouting your next move amongst witty banter is purely an invention of theatre.
Too much talk!
Rovil shouted, his patience finally exhausted. In a swift motion, he grabbed the hostile puppet, throwing it to the ground and pinning it with his sword. The area fell silent for a moment as Gregor attempted to stifle a shriek of agony, eventually succumbing anyway.
Yeah!
Forgotten in the heat of the struggle was the soul-binding magic used to manipulate the puppets. A significant stab wound formed on Gregor's hand, a consequence of his own dark artistry. The encounter had taken an unexpected turn, leaving the puppeteer to face the consequences of his actions.
Ugh! My bloody hands! The beautiful tools of my genius! You absolute arse!
Gregor winced aggressively, crying and drooling in rage and agony, his nose also running profusely.
No, no, no! The show must reach a satisfying conclusion!
Gregor, the hapless puppeteer turned attempted serial killer of a type, was becoming more and more unhinged. The impaled night puppet wriggled grotesquely under the point of Rovil's sword.
Your combat skills are formidable.
Gradasso's voice emanated from the puppet, a twisted blend of agony and bizarre admiration. Rovil's eyes rolled in frustration at Gregor's delusional narcissism.
You may have defeated me, Detective Turkey Feather, but even old villains can become allies with a common enemy.
The Gradasso persona continued its taunting, blending reality and fiction in a disturbing dance. This was getting surprisingly out of hand. Rovil turned to the well where the Thrundle should still be, only to find it gone. His gaze shifted further, and he found himself precariously face to face with the Thrundle.
Have my fiery breath.
Sorry, that was meant to be in the Thrundle's voice.
Gregor clarified. The hinged jaw of the Thrundle dropped open, revealing some manner of makeshift pyrotechnic apparatus, followed by a brief pause in action.
Yes, so I'd gathered. Thank you for clearing that up.
Rovil shouted back, maintaining his sense of wit in the midst of chaos. A mechanical flint and steel device clicked wildly from inside the Thrundle's jaws. In a quick, decisive move, he stabbed into the hinged lower jaw, pinning it back into place. One more click, a hiss of gas, and the Thrundle's wooden head exploded into flames.
Ah-ho-ho!
Gregor howled in intense pain and frustration from his vantage point, seemingly safe from the fray, or so he likely thought. The flames danced with malevolence, licking greedily at the fur of the Thrundle puppet. Gregor's agonized screams pierced the air, his right hand waving manically, the puppet on fire, imitating his every movement and with every violent thrash, becoming even more engulfed in the voracious blaze. The scene unfolded in a surreal display of chaos, a puppeteer's creation transformed into a nightmarish inferno. Rovil, still in close proximity to the flaming puppet, swiftly dodged the enormous disembodied hand puppet, maneuvering himself to a safe distance between it and Gregor. The homicidal puppeteer, his right hand now subjected to worsening burns, collapsed to his knees. Panic seized him, and he desperately tried to extinguish the unseen flames consuming his hand. With his left hand, the very hand controlling the miniature knight Gradasso. Mesmerized by the absurd and surreal puppet show, Rovil watched as the enormous Thrundle puppet, fully engulfed in flames, waved wildly in the air. The scene was a grotesque ballet, a puppet show of pure chaos. The Gradasso puppet, thumping against the flaming Thrundle, caught itself on fire, the smaller puppet becoming consumed in flames much quicker than its larger counterpart. The air crackled with the heat and chaos of the blazing puppets, flying around chaotically in the air, thumping into one another, then thrashing and shaking wildly. Amidst the crackling of flames and Gregor's agonized cries, Rovil couldn't help but feel a strange mix of horror and morbid fascination. The puppeteer's attempt at a grand climax had taken an unexpected turn, leaving Rovil to witness the literal and metaphorical flames of his delusions consuming him.
Gods, please help me! I concede! I concede! I concede to your arrest!
Gregor howled while running up to Rovil, snapping him out of his entranced state. The bizarre puppet show had momentarily captivated the detective. Rovil turned to him, attempting to suppress and failing completely, an amused smile.
You've really no flair for drama at all. Stick to comedy.
Rovil retorted, unable to resist the opportunity to mock Gregor in the midst of his bizarre surrender.
You know nothing of the performing arts!
Gregor impulsively snapped back, managing to be offended even amidst the horrible pain he was experiencing. Rovil, unfazed by the insult, thumped Gregor hard on the head with the pommel of his sword. The impact was forceful enough to render the puppeteer unconscious, and he crumpled to the ground. The puppets, freed from the control of their tormented puppeteer, fell flat to the ground, disconnected from the twisted mind that had manipulated them. The once menacing creations now lay inert. Their fiery performance reached their conclusion, and were now just a foul-scented, smoldering pile of fur, fabric, and wood.